Hi everyone, I'm happy to be with you today to talk about the fourth of the five prisms at IRLE's analyses of regulatory decision making. Prism 4 is public choice economics. It's a good complement to the previous prisms: neoclassical economics, innovation and dynamism, institutions and economic organization. And then final prism, which is the innovator's dilemma, will focus specifically on technology. And that gives us the full suite of very complementary prisms or lenses through which we can analyze regulatory decision making. So today our focus is public choice economics. I like to think about this metaphor of whitewater rafting, because public choice economics is where we apply economic analysis to collective decision making. The metaphor is, we're all in the raft, we're all in the same boat, we're going down the river, we want to enjoy ourselves and we want to get to the end of the river, hopefully unscathed and not too wet. So we have some idea of a shared objective and we all contribute to that objective. That's, I think, a useful metaphor for thinking about collective decision-making, or what we call in economics collective action. And it's not a perfect metaphor because it assumes a kind of sharedness of outcome that I think is not as true when we talk about political decision-making in a large, diverse political entity. But it gets us started by thinking of, okay, there are certain things that in order for us to have, useful things that we have to do together. How best do we do them? And as social scientists, how do we analyze those to evaluate the results of those arrangements? And public choice economics is one of a couple of different fields in economics and political science more broadly that we use to analyze these ideas. And there are three core premises of public choice economics: methodological individualism, behavioral symmetry, and politics as exchange. And I'm going to go through each of those in turn and explain them briefly. Methodological individualism is a really important foundation of economics, and not just of public choice economics. Notice here that I've said methodological and not ethical individualism, right? This is not a normative statement of the kind of ethics of individual morality. It's much more a focus, and this is a focus that's common in economics, on the individual as the agent of choice, the individual as the agent of change, the individual as the actor and the decision maker. So that's the sense in which it's methodological individualism, that the methodology of economics starts by analyzing individual decisions, individual preferences, individual incentives, and then we build up from there into collective decision-making in families, in firms, in communities, in larger communities. But it's all grounded in the idea that individuals are purposeful and that individuals are decision makers. And what can influence individuals is institutions, right? The kind of rules, the formal and informal rules and norms that shape our incentives and shape our interactions with each other. Those institutions can certainly influence people's decisions, but the individual is the decision maker. And that's what defines methodological individualism, which has a very long history in economics and before that in political theory, going all the way back to Hobbes's Leviathan. The second core premise of public choice is behavioral symmetry, which, being an 80s alternative music fan, I tend to think of as people are people. And that the idea is that we use behavioral symmetry to analyze individual decisions in the political sphere. They're still the same people in the political sphere as they are in the economic sphere. that in our roles as political actors and as economic actors, we do still have the same underlying incentives, extent to which we respond to incentives, and the same motivations. What differs, the thing that differs primarily between political and economic contexts is the institutions, right? In an economic context, for example, in a market transaction, right, you have a buyer and a seller, you have a legal framework that defines what can and cannot be involved and can constitute a contract. In the political setting, you have the rules for how we're going to come together and make this collective decision. And it's a very different institutional setting from what we more conventionally see in markets. The third core premise of public choice economics is the idea of politics as exchange, that we can think of politics as a shared enterprise with mutual gains to cooperation. And that if we engage in a political enterprise, that it can be win-win, right? That there are gains from political trade, as well as we see gains from trade in economics. And at least in a US context, this is very much the Madisonian aspect of public choice. And there is definitely a Madisonian aspect of public choice. If you go back, we can trace some public choice roots, as I said, back to Hobbes and back to Madison for some of the thread of public choice economics that focuses on constitutional design. But there's a long history and family tree of the different pieces of political theory and economic theory that wind together to give us public choice economics. And one of them is definitely the Madisonian piece, which has really contributed to the research in constitutional design that's been a big part of public choice economics for the past 60 years. Just to illustrate some of the applications of public choice economics, I just mentioned constitutional design. One of the other aspects that's very important is voting, and the idea of what rule do you use when you're choosing in groups. What kind of rule do you use? Well, typically we think of it as voting. Do you use majority rule? Do you use a supermajority? Do you use unanimity? So which rule do you use? And if you're voting on a fairly complicated set of things, rather than just, should we have ice cream or cake? If it's something more complicated than that, somebody usually gets to set the agenda, the order in which we're going to do things, and the procedures by which we're going to do things. And so that part of the voting process is very important. We also have research in what's called vote cycling, the idea that depending on the preferences of everyone who's voting, you can have different outcomes depending on the order in which you put things up for vote. And that itself has a very long history going back to the 18th century French kind of political theorist and statistician Condorcet. The constitutional design and voting portions of public choice have been really important, and some of the foundations going back to the 1950s and the work of Anthony Downs in political science, and also going back to the work of Jim Buchanan, who's pictured here on the right, who received the Nobel Prize in 1986 for his path-breaking work in establishing the constitutional design research within and the field of public choice economics more broadly. Some of the other applications of public choice go to analyzing legislative decision making, right? So if you had a democratic process and you've elected through whatever voting rules you're applying, you've elected your representatives and they get together in a representative assembly. What incentives do they have and how do they behave and what kind of outcomes do we get? And so that analyzes behavior such as log rolling, or again, the agenda setting and who gets to have the power associated with agenda setting. For those of us who are interested in regulation, public choice economics focuses more on bureaucracies and administrative agencies and the incentives that the institutional structure in which they operate presents to the people who are in those roles. And we also analyze the kind of broader category I would call of rent seeking. And rent is a kind of confusing word that we use in economics, but a rent, basically think of it as a benefit or a financial benefit or a return to getting a political decision to go your way. That if you are able to influence the political process to come to an outcome that is favorable to you, then you enjoy the benefits associated with that. And that's called rent seeking. That's a fairly big category in public choice economics, analyzing the role of interest groups, the behavior of interest groups, and the opportunities for and the incentives for special interests to try to influence the outcomes of political decision making. So I want to focus on that idea in general, the idea and the behavior that comes out of that we call lobbying, where lobbying is the process by which interested parties try to influence decision makers to make decisions that are more favorable to them. In particular, I want to focus on one aspect of this, which is the idea of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. And this comes out of the really important work of the political economist Mansur Olson in his book, The Logic of Collective Action. And that just opened a flurry of subsequent research. The idea is fairly simple, that if you are in a setting where a political entity, say a legislature, is considering passing a statute that will lead to an outcome X, and outcome X is going to have concentrated benefits for a very small number of parties, but the costs of implementing X are going to be diffuse, are going to be spread out over the entire population, that if you have concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, then the small number of parties that would get those concentrated benefits, they have an incentive to lobby to try to influence the political decision-making process. And so that's, again, an example of rent seeking. You can also think of it the flip way, that if there's a piece of statute being considered to implement to do X, and the costs of X would be very concentrated, but the benefits would be spread out and dispersed, that then there would be an incentive for special interests to lobby to prevent X from being passed. One example of this type of concentrated benefit and diffuse cost dynamic comes from in 2013, when there were $1.1 billion in federal loans made to processors of sugar in the US. The US sugar industry is famously concentrated and is essentially three large family-owned firms. And they get that $1.1 billion in federal loans, and the costs associated with those loans are borne by American taxpayers. Similarly, the sugar industry has very effectively, these small number of sugar companies in the US have very effectively lobbied for protectionism. For example, we have very high tariffs against the imports of Brazilian cane sugar, and those protectionist measures raise the cost of sugar to everyone because they reduce competition. And so these three sugar producers in the US can charge a higher price for sugar than they would otherwise because they face less competition. That's a concentrated benefit that raises their revenues. The costs, though, are dispersed among everyone in the US who buys sugar. And most of us who buy sugar do so in relatively small amounts. And so the associated costs are spread out over all of us, and each of us individually bears a very small portion. So this phenomenon of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs is one dynamic that we see a lot in as a framework for helping us to understand and analyze this particular type of rent seeking. Another dynamic that we see is very colorfully called by Bruce Yandel, bootleggers and Baptists. And this is a dynamic of interest groups forming coalitions to lobby for particular outcomes. The narrative that he tells is consider a community that is thinking about passing a statute to ban liquor sales on Sundays. The bootleggers are, of course, going to be in favor of such a statute, and they're going to have an incentive to try to influence the outcome in their direction, because if the liquor stores are closed on Sundays, that's less competition for them on Sundays. So they've got the entire Sunday market to themselves. So the bootleggers would be in favor of that statute. Another party with very divergent interests from bootleggers is the Baptists. But they too would be in favor of banning liquor sales on Sundays. Their interests are not so much in their own commercial gain. Their interests are, of course, in the souls of their flock. And so you have two parties with very divergent objectives, but they have this shared interest in advocating for passage of the statute that would ban liquor sales on Sundays. And so this is an application of interest group theory that shows that interest groups with diverse objectives can collaborate to try to achieve mutually beneficial political outcomes. Another phenomenon that is a very important subject of public choice economics analysis is regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is defined as a situation in which a political entity serves the specific commercial, ideological, or political interests of a minor constituency. It's captured in, so to speak, in this idea of there being, commercial influence or corporate influence, quote unquote, for example, in Congress in the US. And this is a political cartoon from the late 19th century, illustrating the idea that the various big commercial trusts of the time, the steel beam trust, the copper trust, and so on, that they're sitting there in the halls of Congress, kind of overseeing what's going on in Senate and influencing what's going on in the Senate. The idea is very much that regulatory capture is a situation in which the regulated industry is able to influence the regulators to make decisions that are favorable to the industry. And this has been, again, a topic of deep analysis within public choice economics. The phrase regulatory capture dates to 1974, when Ann Kruger, who's at Duke, she was analyzing some trade legislation and trade regulation and the implementation of protectionist measures. And she coined this phrase regulatory capture to illustrate the idea that the industry that was nominally being regulated was itself able to influence the regulator. There's also a fairly large literature on regulatory capture in the Federal Communications Commission in the mid-20th century, and some of the decisions that they made regarding things like regulating the hushaphone and the things that you could or could not attach to your telephone. Right? So this is a very robust area of study that's applicable to regulation. There are some critiques of public choice analysis, and in particular, the critique you hear most frequently of public choice economics is that it assumes that the motivation of people as political actors is self-interested and is not kind of publicly beneficent or publicly motivated. And I guess to that I would say yes and no, because, for example, if you think about trying to model the decisions of a elected representative, a member of Congress, and certainly that member of Congress wants to do things that would benefit the constituents of their district. So they may not be self-interested in that sense, that they are interested in the outcomes of their constituents. But in order for them to achieve that, they do have to get elected and they have to get reelected. And so the use of self-interest and methodological individualism as a lens through which to analyze that member of Congress's incentives, it's very much about their interest in getting elected and they're getting reelected. And that is still taking a self-interested perspective from a positive political economy analysis sense. And I do think it is also true that public choice economics does not take into account other motivations, such as public interest theory, right? And public interest theory is what suffuses public utility regulation since its origins in the progressive era. And the whole idea, going back to Munn versus Illinois, of regulation, quote unquote, in the public interest, and that there is indeed some definable notion of a public interest. I think of public choice economics as an alternate theory to public interest theory. And I would say in reality that it's not an either or, it's a both and that I think both frameworks bring something to the party in terms of enabling us to analyze what goes on in political and regulatory decision making. The economist Jim Buchanan, who I mentioned earlier, it had a very insightful essay a few years ago, basically an overview of public choice economics, in which he titled Public Choice: Politics Without Romance. And so he basically argued that, and at some level there is kind of a, with, especially in the US, right, the founders and the origins of the American Republic, that we do have a bit of a romance that we attach to politics. I think public choice economics doesn't negate that romance per se, but rather says there are other dimensions of our political action. There are other dimensions of political decision making, and we can use the tools of economic analysis and a focus on incentives to analyze those and to understand them more deeply. So in summary, I think some of the main insights from public choice are that public choice economics gives us a positive, as opposed to a positive political economy that we can use to analyze the incentives and outcomes that occur in collective action when we make choices in groups, when we choose in groups. And we do that by applying the three core premises, and that yields us a lot of insights. Right? If you combine methodological individualism, the economic tools of behavioral symmetry, and then the kind of political realist Madisonian politics as exchange, gains from trade, you combine those, you really get a lot of insights into political processes, log rolling in legislative contexts, regulatory capture, and so on. The insights are actually quite rich. And they are insights into real phenomena that we observe, and we, especially in our areas of work, that we interact with regularly. And so looking at public choice economics and using the tools of public choice economics in combination with other prisms of economics help us to understand more deeply the interactions that we see in collective decision-making contexts and situations.